Hello and welcome back, students. We will get going into our lecture for Chapter 5 on non-democratic regimes. This chapter is going to be all about authoritarian political systems. These are systems in which governments are really not in any way, shape, or form accountable to citizens. Some of the key points I'm going to make in this lecture are that number one, there's a substantial variation in the kinds of authoritarian systems. The second point that I'd like to make is that most authoritarian leaders are still constrained by political institutions, but they're constrained in very different ways, obviously, than democratic leaders are. We can imagine that in our own system when we look inward. But China, Iran, and North Korea are, sort of the running examples in the slides that will follow, both because of their intrinsic importance and because of their complexity. So, what we have here are really, in a sense, non democratic regimes that are oftentimes defined by what they lack. And they are certainly lacking characteristics of democracy, voting right, multi parties, or at least a legitimately competitive political party, staggered elections, um, things of that nature. As well as free and fair elections, and that's they're lacking those aspects and many other things that we'll get into in this lecture. But these regimes, they really deny their citizens participation, competition, and liberty. Sometimes these are also called authoritarian regimes or authoritarianism. Non democratic regimes really come in a wide variety of forms, regardless of the form that they ultimately end up taking. They do have a few things that are in common. And so I think it would be important for us to go over those commonalities. Um, yes, while all totalitarian regimes are ultimately authoritarian, not all authoritarian regimes are totalitarian in nature. People frequently misuse this term to describe the regimes that they don't like. Um, and political scientists have really sort of a strict definition of what totalitarianism entails. And there's really only a handful of non democratic regimes that fall under that definition or that would match that definition. One major criticism of these terms was that when it was developed, it was used to describe Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, which were very different types of non democracies. This ultimately led some people, mostly policymakers and the general public, to mistakenly equate fascism and communism. Let's not forget that the United States was fighting along; they were aligned with the Soviet Union in assisting taking out this fascist dictatorship under Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. But really, since this term of totalitarianism and authoritarianism, these terms they have limited scholarly utility. Some comparative scholars argue that we should just abandon it and instead classify things into non-democratic regimes based on the structures of their governments, i.e., if we look at the fascism, communism examples there, basically the same way that we would define democratic regimes. All right, next slide here. The reason totalitarianism really might be rare is it has something to do with state capacity rather than the goals of leaders. Very few governments have the power um, and the capacity to radically transform state institutions. So this is we're just kind of going over some key points here of totalitarian regimes. We can look at North Korea up here on the next slide. Um, Certainly, that's the closest state that scholars have come to pin down under this term of totalitarianism. Although there are others that could be made a particular argument for, I guess really depends on what your definition of totalitarianism is and your starting point there. But the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin is commonly given as an example of a totalitarian regime. Most domestic institutions were radically restructured. Many aspects of private life were controlled by the state and the Communist Party. And then millions of people were impoverished or executed. However, no later Soviet Union leader was able or willing to exercise this degree of control. So once Stalin had passed away, Soviet Union behaved much more like a traditional authoritarian regime and should not be defined as totalitarian. And so the Soviet Union, we can say under Joseph Stalin, certainly had those totalitarian instincts to them or characteristics. But after Stalin, hard to say that it's a totalitarian regime. This leads us to believe that sort of a country that's been recently described as totalitarian is Syria under Bashir al Assad. Even before the recent civil war, this regime had pretty much fallen short of our definition of being a totalitarian regime. The Ba'athist Party, they lack a strong ideology, and the state was considerably less centralized in Damascus than many other outsiders had imagined. And so, the competing groups during that civil war, the rebels, there's from the American perspectives, there's still very little known about these rebels, or fairly much at all, at least in the public domain, what's available to us in the literature. I mean, again, if this term refers, when we're talking about totalitarianism, more to the capacity of a non democracy rather than a way of governance, it proves little use to researchers who are seeking to understand non democratic differences. Okay, so let's move on to the North Korea example. In the modern era, North Korea, it seems to me like it's about the closest definition that we have to totalitarianism in the modern era. Scholars debate whether or not this term really adequately fits the state. Um, Others contend that the North Korean regime fits more of a personalistic dictatorship and that totalitarianism overstates the power of the North Korean government. Kim Jong Un, who is the most recent leader of the Kim dynasty, is the first secretary of the Korean Workers' Party, the first chairman of the National Defense Commission, and the supreme commander of the Korean People's Army. The founding member of that dynasty, Kim Il sung, died in 1994. He is referred to as their eternal president, and Kim Jong un's father and the predecessor, Kim Jong il, passed away in 2011, and in North Korea is known as their eternal general secretary. Now, one important point to make is that the state controls every aspect of public life in North Korea. All television stations are state controlled. Individuals are limited in their use of cell phones, if they even have a cell phone that they have accessible. and the state's extremely limited um, intranet. There is no really no internet there. It's an intranet. It's heavily censored. So this is, something that is very close to it's very Orwellian, straight out of 1984. Jobs and education are certainly controlled through state appointment, and no independent civil society exists, i.e., your interest groups, right? So considerable state resources, and this is an estimate from a 2012 article. They say that about 100 million for that year go into cultivating a personality cult around the Kim family, generating um, really a fanatic deviation or devotion, I should say, even though some might want to deviate from being there among the population. Well, there's been some move toward privatization as a means to build sort of a nascent consumer market. Most of the economy in North Korea still remains firmly under state control. So there is a huge amount of people that, um, the vast majority of the population that really, give their praise to the Kim family and the Kim dynasty. When it comes to human rights abuses and regime violence, Amnesty International has ranked North Korea in a category of its own. They say that it's the most repressive state in the modern world. So let's see. Let's go ahead and move on to some of the aspects of modernization and non-democratic rule. Sort of old way of thinking, new way of thinking about these regimes. There are a lot of different historical and current examples of how economic development has proven disruptive to societies, which are triggering support for non democratic leaders and the leaders to the overthrow of democratic governments. So, economics is a really big factor in all of this. If the middle class is being sort of squeezed, or the middle class was growing and is now shrinking, that takes an effect on the public's minds. We can clearly see this in Chile. 1973 military coup came amid fears of the growing influence of left-leaning political parties centered on a new urban working class. So, more recently, some scholars have argued that ongoing urbanization in China may be reinforcing the regime as people fear chaos, um, and other aspects. We look towards the Arab Spring, Egypt's 2011 protests. They had a massive wave that was followed by a military coup, and the promise of stability was a key reason for why many of the former protesters, at least initially, had supported the new military regime. Non democratic regimes can be poor or wealthy, um, when we look at GDPs. Countries like Singapore and many other Persian Gulf states are often cited as modern and economically advanced states, but also as states that have really these highly institutionalized non democracies. Modernization seems to have reinforced traditional authoritarian leaders. The UAE, United Arab Emirates, is known for Dubai, perhaps one of the most modern and international cities in the Middle East. But the UAE is also an emirate, an Islamic monarchy practicing Sharia law. Recent wealth has seemed to reinforce these old regimes rather than to challenge them. And we shouldn't completely discount the whole idea that wealth leads to democracy argument. But most countries with a per capita GDP, purchasing power parity of more than $20,000 are, in fact, democracies. In some countries, elites may fear sharing power. Um, we certainly saw that in Kenya with the Kibaki regime, and there was a big fallout in that election in 2007. I won't get into that, but there's no doubt in my mind that and in many other people's minds that elites are afraid of sharing power. Why? Mostly because it might threaten their control of wealth. Because the state is a means to siphon off resources and maintain economic control, state leaders are going to resist reform, because that means giving up their assets and possibly losing their lives in retribution for past behavior from somebody else, especially if there's a coup. Usually, coups are not peaceful. They're generally violent, where somebody's overthrown or taken out onto the streets and knifed or gunned down, or some sort of political violence is taking place. We'll get into that. That's a whole nother chapter in this course. But there's something called the resource curse that I want to explain and go over. States that are, and essentially the resource curse explains this: states exporting primary commodities are less likely to be democracies. Really, a common explanation is that elites are better off if they repress dissent than allow democracy. Again, elites are better off if they repress dissent than allow democracy, since they really don't need the active support and participation of a population in order to sustain their profits. So, although other resources like diamonds, timber, or metals have been argued to trigger this problem, the overwhelming evidence is that oil is most consistently tied to this problem of the resource curse. Okay, so let's take a look at an example of this resource curse, particularly in Zimbabwe. It's a non democracy, and in many ways, it's a classic example of this resource trap. Zimbabwe has a considerable amount um, of diamond resources, and they also have platinum too, by the way. Some of these countries are interesting to take a look at, particularly if they have those rare earth metals that are used for making our cell phones. Because Apple is constantly, upgrading their cell phones with AI and that sort of thing, and they're coming out with newer and faster iPhones, and so everybody ditches their old one and they have to produce more. But yeah, the platinum diamond resources in a country like Zimbabwe, really, really resource wealthy in those terms. But a lot of Zimbabwe's mining profits have gone to the military and to members of Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe African National Union. That's what they call the Patriotic Front Party. And anyways, in a country with widespread poverty, malnutrition, weak infrastructure, and not to mention rampant inflation, in that particular nation state, health issues, Mugabe's inner circle has plundered an estimated $2 billion in the diamond trade alone. Just recently read something about how actually diamonds they're struggling to sell diamonds. It is a supply and demand classic economic example of a commodity. Um, but it's interesting because people are getting married later in life. The population in many countries in wealthy, affluent countries is shrinking. So, anyways, but this slide is not dealing with the diamond trade necessarily, but just to underscore the fact that you have a leader in Zimbabwe that is just really plundering and stealing from that country, and $2 billion in the diamond trade just poof gone. The elite were able to use this wealth to just embolden their political power that they already have, specifically funding the secret police. This is known as the CIO, the Zimbabwe Central Intelligence Organization. as well as the military. Um, they are ensuring that they stay in power. These institutions are part of what comparativists sometimes term the coercive apparatus of the state, the institutions that allow the state to spy on their population and repress political challengers or anybody speaking out against them, criticizing their power. Um, and so we'll use these terms in a later section, but these institutions allow the state to conduct surveillance and coercion, keeping their population in line through fear tactics. Many of us might be familiar with that. But Zimbabwe is an example of how the resource trap can strengthen non democratic rule, as Mugabe's dictatorship has used the country's diamond wealth to strengthen those loyal to him, as well as help keep the secret police and military forces fat and happy. It's also another good example of the role of that international actors can play. While the US and the European Union have criticized Mugabe's government in recent years, China has provided over $1 billion in loans and really aided the country. And this photo that we have up here, I believe Mugabe has passed away since. So this is we're just kind of again giving an example of a past leader. Um, this photo is featuring Bobby Mugabe at a ribbon cutting ceremony of a hydropower project that has been funded and constructed by the Chinese. So Mugabe cut rights of foreign companies, including the Chinese, in 2016, a move that had it really undermined China's support for the regime. So we can't, as you can see, we can't really have a discussion, or at least a fair discussion of Zimbabwe without also talking about Chinese politics, given that they've heavily invested around the continent of Africa, not just in Zimbabwe, but all over sub-Saharan Africa. And they haven't had a whole lot of return on their investments. China's Belt and Road Initiative has been a long range project and in the works for many years so far. And to complicate matters even more, an earlier point that I made, Zimbabwe battles extremely high inflation. And so, even if a society or civil society is strong, the values it promotes may actually undermine democracy. Populism is a political view that does not rely on a consistent ideology, but it instead emphasizes hostility towards elites and established state and economic institutions. Non democratic leaders who use populism or leverage it may claim that they are promoting greater power in the hands of the public and the people, but they're actually using it to undermine any opposition who might challenge their power. In addition, just because civil society is strong doesn't necessarily guarantee that there will be or that they will behave, civil society that is, behave in a way that is conducive to democratic values. When intolerance comes to dominate, people could be willing to accept moves that undermine the fairness of democracy in the interest of keeping their own group in power. And ultimately, if people participate in the game of politics but argue that unless they win the game, then it must be rigged, democracy is in danger. And a more recent example of a populist and one that has used a strong non democratic civil society to his advantage is Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Orban has framed his consolidation of power and breaking of Hungarian democracy as a means to return power to the people. He has played on national sentiments, especially anti Muslim fears, to fuel xenophobia and justify the consolidation of power under his current political party. When we finished World War II. The USSR sometimes forcibly shaped the governments of Eastern Europe, even though they had no longer had under their auspice of power some of those Eastern states there were about 15 of them that broke up that were part of the Soviet Union. Certainly, we can see with Belarus, it's very much under the purview of the Russian state. But yeah, I mean, they were trying to shape those governments, just in terms of who was leading them, and ending democratic movements and eliminating civil society. That was another big part of their goal. They would later reinforce these satellite regimes, crushing revolts in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. In some countries, an imperial legacy may reinforce non democratic elements. Poorly drawn borders can create ethnic and religious divisions, making consensus difficult and increasing the incentive that more powerful groups may turn to authoritarianism as a way to monopolize power. Imperial institutions may also lead to uneven modernization, where you have a larger wealth disparity between the rich and the poor, and a weak state autonomy and capacity, giving an opportunity for populist leaders or military strongmen to go ahead and step into this power vacuum and fill that. During the Cold War, the United States would often back non democratic leaders as long as they were committed to fighting communism. That was kind of the only thing that the United States cared about at that time. It was a battle of ideas. So we see this in South Vietnam, and see it in other countries like Egypt. And at times, this involved, the U.S. sponsoring the overthrow of democratically elected regimes that didn't necessarily agree with our politics, like what happened in Iran in 1953 and Chile that I referenced earlier in 1973. So we're getting down towards the end of this slide here, just kind of highlighting some of these examples. But more recently, Russia and China have promoted non democratic regimes in neighboring countries and in the Middle East. They're sort of doing what's in their best interest or as they see it. Regional powers like Iran and Saudi Arabia have sought to use their oil wealth to support like minded regimes. And I mean, I guess that's rational choice theory in many ways. Um, but Iran is a long supporter of the Assad regime in Syria, and Saudi Arabia has actively intervened to support pro Saudi governments in Bahrain in 2011 and Yemen in 2015. So, oh, you know what? I don't know if I have a slide that's repeating here. Um, Let me get to, well, I don't believe these slides repeat, but we are going to get into coercion in the second half of this lecture. Um, and let me just kind of go over some things here briefly, because we're getting to the midpoint of this lecture. Some people used to think that democracy was an inherently Western and specifically Protestant Christian artifact, something that emerged because of Europe's specific history and culture. So, really, as a result, it would be impossible or inappropriate to export democracy to other cultural contexts. This view has really faded among academics, and today, the people who tend to make this argument are mostly dictators seeking to justify their own rule and really exploit maybe even an uneducated population to a degree. Now, one thing can be said about, there is the democratic peace theory, which I probably should have created a slide in and of itself or on its own, where it essentially states that democracies don't go to war with one another. this is a good example to showcase when we get to the chapter on political violence. But we can think of very few, if any at all, examples of where democracies fight wars with other democracies. So that is one thing to kind of keep in the back of your mind. And as democracy has spread to other regions of the world, other scholars emphasize that democracy is based on universal values of human dignity and empowerment, values that transcend cultures. So, really, for these scholars, culture might shape the form of a government as a society adapts to it, the type of civil society that may emerge that shapes the political institutions, but does not sentence a society to be democratic or undemocratic. Those aren't necessarily the determining characteristics. So we come to the question here of how exactly do authoritarian leaders maintain and sustain their political control? It's a critical question that we should address, and all 3 points on this slide really are correct answers. Coercion and surveillance, which we touched on just a bit, co-adaptation, personality cults. We sort of mentioned that with the Kim dynasty. Um, and so I believe this is a really good stopping point for us. And we're going to go ahead and wrap up this chapter's lecture on the second half that will be posted shortly.